sort of diamond-shaped country. Okay? A line was drawn across it with a ruler, and the northern part is Dutch-speaking, Flemish-speaking, and the southern part is French-speaking. And Brussels is a little island in the northern part, which is bilingual, which means that it's French-speaking in reality. The University of Louvain was a bilingual university north of the border, and it decided that the French component of it decided that it would move south of the linguistic border and establish a new university. And then the question is, what kind of university do you want to have? And a conscious decision, a self-conscious decision was, we do not want to have an American ghetto campus. Okay. Good or bad, that was a decision made. What do you use an alternative? And here there was an effort to integrate the town and gown. So the dark buildings in this slide are university buildings, and the rest are non-university buildings. So students have to walk back and forth down the spine, which is illustrated on the right in the slide. And so there's a constant life in the center of the town, except of course during vacation time when the town tends to be somewhat dead. Where did this idea come from? Okay? And it's looking back to the medieval town. The question is, what is the legitimacy of doing that today? Now, Louvain is a very pleasant town. It's very basic, but it's a pleasant place to be walking through. And judging by the students that I've seen there, a reasonably pleasant place to study. I must admit, most of them get in the train on the weekend and go to Brussels, which is a lot more fun. And so what we're dealing here with is a conscious decision to create something similar to the city which has grown unself-consciously over time. Lots of little self-conscious decisions, but as a whole, it's an unself-conscious composition. And this stands in strong contrast with the ideas which were current in the 1960s. The standard paradigm was the modernist paradigm. And this was a conscious reaction to it. Now, Le Corbusier's comment on all this is that you're designing for the way of the donkey. We're not donkeys anymore. We are rational people. And picking up on the vernacular in that sense is an irrational idea. Empirically, it may work quite well, but we live in a new age and we need new designs. My second case study is for a competition that I was the senior juror, and it was a closed competition, and it was really organized by the property developer, so it was never officially recognized as an international composition. But this is for the new central business district, or a new central business district for Dammam in Saudi Arabia. Now, if you look at standard vernacular, I presume you can call them vernacular, town patterns which have grown up over time in the region, they show a very compact world of narrow streets, relatively narrow streets, and relatively low houses. If you look at the Palm in Dubai, which is drawn here at the same scale, you'll see a very, very different environment and a very different set of what I borrow a term from a psychologist, James Gibson, of affordances for a variety of activities and for a sense of place. So creating a new sense of place. The competition entries vary considerably. The one by RTKL, which is on the left in the slide, was really a modernist, or even maybe a hyper-modernist design, except the architecture is not that dramatically different from the norm. Then there was a series of entries rather like the one on the right. And you wonder what the architects had in mind. They were looking at the vernacular, but then they create spaces which would be absolutely boiling hot for much of the time. In contrast, one team, which is Duane Platter-Zyberg team, but not either of those two architects, but a Lebanese woman by the name of Marianne Khoury, who produced this design. And she looked at the vernacular, which is on the left in the slide, and reinterpreted it. And the question is, has she captured the essence? Has she captured the principles behind the design, the vernacular architecture, and managed to reshape it in a new form? And so her design ended up looking a bit like this. It's much more compact. It can be low-rise or it can be high-rise. The competition was distorted, unfortunately, by not allowing for parking underneath buildings. Not allowing for parking below ground. It could be underneath buildings, but not below ground. So the schemes got a little distorted. And so these were the two opposing views of the design. When I show this to students, almost automatically they go for the RTKL design. You can explain to them why the design on the right, what its attributes are, but they want one on the left because of the imagery. And the imagery is one of being modern, being up to date, and being at the cutting edge of knowledge and competing with the global world and the marketplace of that world. So there are a series of questions arise from this. And the question of the legitimacy of looking at the vernacular, reinterpreting it, what are you capturing, what are you not capturing, and so on. And so we can end up with a series of questions. Case study 3. Two buildings by an architect who I admire. I know there are people in the audience here who don't admire him as much as I do, but I have tremendous admiration for him, Wright. And he was inspired by the arid climate architecture. I'm not sure that it was specifically Jaisalmer, but it was places like Jaisalmer. And I think a lot of architects really admire the architecture of arid climates. Very often it's the wonderful sandstone and the coloring against the bright blue sky. Maybe it's the cubical forms, I'm not sure what, but it captures the imagination. And so you can reinterpret this, and this is a design that he did for the Asiad Games Village. The problem is that you now have cars, and what do you do with a car? You put it on the periphery. And so what happens in this design, and everything gets switched around, so the front doors become the back doors, and so on. And you're dealing with a different culture, you're dealing with a different climate. And this becomes more obvious in this example. When I visited it, it looked like the big image on the left. And that's the image that you see in architectural books. But it was designed for a completely different climate. This is in Navi Mumbai. And so today, it has changed in character, and you have to deal with the realities of the world. So the message is one has to be very careful about the imagery of what you're doing, but also its functionality, and other than symbolic terms, but how it works within the climate, how it works within our contemporary culture. And again, we can look at another example which has fascinated me, and it also deals with hot arid climates, and these are designs that you probably know quite well. This is the vernacular, and then an effort to recreate the vernacular, the principles of the vernacular in a new world. And I admire this design. The only problem with it is that it's going to be done piece by piece. And it'll never end up looking a bit like this, because individual entrepreneurs within the city will be wanting to do things their own way. The architects will be wanting to do things their own way. And so you can get a similar design dealing with similar principles. Now, instead of looking at the vernacular, you could simply read the literature on how to design in hot, humid, hot, arid, cold winter climates, and so on. The literature is huge. Out of the University of Waterloo in Ontario, there's been studies of designing for Arctic climates over many, many years. The number of books which deal with designing for tropical climates is also voluminous. And yet, we don't look at it. We get captured by a current image and go, yeah, but this is also a danger of getting captured by a vernacular image. And so the whole series of questions arise, and a series of difficulties in translating the vernacular. One really has to understand what the principles are that generate the architecture, rather than saying, oh, I like that, and picking up on it. And the principles, some of the principles remain the same, but we're living in a very different world. So there's a lot to learn from the vernacular, but we have to be very careful about it. I'm going to follow this up with a couple of American examples. This is the Florida vernacular. Florida is a big state, and there are a number of vernacular designs, but this tends to be on the Gulf side. And you can see the porch, which is a very useful transition space from the outside to the inside. It's also a place where you would sit in the summer to capture the breezes in the pre-air conditioned days. And this was the inspiration for the developer of Seaside. And this is a point that I may come back to later on when I'm introducing Mickey Desai. We get captured by our childhoods, okay? And the developer of this, a man by the name of Davies, said he wanted to create an environment like those of his childhood in the region, okay? And the architecture was that vernacular that I showed you. Now you're dealing with a very different world. You're dealing a world, this is a much more affluent world, and the idea was that people would sit on the porches and greet passers-by. But it's hot, and people prefer to be in air-conditioned comfort. This is a very, very tightly controlled design. Okay? You have to have a picket fence. Your picket fence has to be different from your neighbor's picket fence. Okay? You have to have this, you have to have that. The colors have to come from this range. And many architects are very willing to work with that, but other architects say, I want to do my own thing. And they haven't, by and large, been involved in this design. So these are the questions, again, a series of questions. What do you do? What is it that you're looking at? What do you replicate? How do you deal with a car? Right now, we've been through a whole long phase of designing for the car, well, not designing for the car, but designing for the driver. Okay? Now we're much more concerned with walkability and making cities where it's easy to reach local destinations on foot. And maybe that is what we can learn from the vernacular. But what do you do with a car? And so on. And now, of course, the question is, what do you do when we have autonomous vehicles? Will this change the shape of streets? And then you say, well, the shape of streets hasn't really changed at all over the millennia. But will it? What about storage of cars? Most cars are not in use for 90% of the time. And so you end up with a very picturesque environment, which is much enjoyed by many, many people. A friend of mine went, when she was a fellow at Harvard, went on a field trip to Seaside and looked in the grocery store. There were about 20 types of olive oil, but no cornflakes. Okay? And so it's a very, very strange world. Now for a very different example. And this raises a question, what does it mean to be Indonesian or Indian or British? Okay, and that's too broad a question. What does it mean to be New York? We come down to a city. We want to have an area which is New York. Now at this stage, when I'm presenting this to students, I get them to draw a New York building. What's their imagination of a New York building? So in your head right now, think, what is a New York building? What does it look like? What's its nature? Well, the decision in Battery Park City, and this is Battery Park City, it's a photograph taken from Hoboken 2 years ago, I guess. You can read the small writing at the bottom, it will tell you. And that is #1 World Trade Center, which has grown up behind it. Battery Park City is in the foreground, and it consists of two components. It consists of an international component, which is the Commerce Center, which is now called Brookfield Place because of the Brookfield organization taking it over. And the tower that you see there is designed by Caesar Pelli. And the same tower you can see in Bilbao and in Canary Wharf in London. It's essentially same building with a little bit of external differences. Okay, but the rest was to be a New York. And the question then becomes, what do you look at? And so this applies also to the vernacular. What vernacular are you looking at if you're looking for inspiration? And so, the question, what does it really mean? And this is the architecture that emerged from the result of that discussion. And this is one little component of it. And it is based on areas of New York which New Yorkers love. Not what outsiders or international people have or an image of New York. And interestingly enough, this whole idea has been totally rejected in the design of Hudson Yards and Midtown Manhattan, which really wants to be another Dubai, because Dubai is now setting the pace for international urban design, for good or for bad. Okay, so it was a long, narrow site, and the buildings were designed to have bases and meet the street. They were designed with a whole set of very, very tight guidelines to be like buildings in Gramercy Park area and Morningside Heights. And so this is what we ended up with. The earlier photograph was a much more recent photograph of this than this one, but it shows you had to build to the property line, you had to build no entrances on the corner, entrances had to be in the middle of the block. Okay? Buildings had to have a base, they had to have string courses at certain levels, there had to be a specific ratio of wall to window space. Okay? They had to have a top. Okay? Now luckily for the people making this design, there was a real competition for the design for building here from property developers, so they were willing to go along. If this had been done 10 years earlier, and you remember New York almost went broke, and Philadelphia, where I worked for many years, almost went broke. I did work for them in the 1980s, and I got paid for it in 1996. They just weren't capable of paying it. So this was a demand for development, and so you can get the guidelines followed. And this is the model of New York. Is this your imagination of New York? And maybe it is. Certainly, in terms of the New York that I tend to inhabit, it looks a bit like these two places. Okay, so you end up with a complex like that. Now, this is just a little diagram done. Actually, it was done for a study of Jakarta, but it shows that to get your guidelines in place, they had to be very clear. You had to have somebody who can administrate them honestly. Mm-hmm. And so these are the prime criteria, and they have to be understood. If people understand why the guidelines exist, if architects understand that, they're much more willing to go along with them than if they sense that these are arbitrary. and they're just your opinion, and my opinion is different. But if they're grounded on evidence, they're much more likely to succeed. The fundamental question is, though, that's all technical. Who sets the goals? Who decides? And right now it tends to be what we call the power elite. It's the bankers, it is the property developers, and a remarkably small group of architectural firms who practice internationally. The term power elite was developed for analyzing American cities in the 1950s and American decision-making in America. And it came to the conclusion that America was really run by maybe 300 people, not by the democratic institutions. So, a final example is okay. This is some of you have been here, and I'd be very interested in knowing your observation. It's really trying to recreate a vernacular. And it also shows the power of individuals. This area of Dubai is now being gentrified, and it has been turned into a tourist destination, artistic colony, and so on. And the reason it wasn't demolished was that Prince Charles of the United Kingdom and sundry other countries visited and told the administration that it shouldn't be demolished. So the power of individuals can be quite strong if you have a position in society. And again, this is an example which will be familiar to many of you. We work internationally, and we develop a style of working. We are architects. We develop a style of working that we carry with us. And so whether it's the vernacular or current designs, we tend to borrow them from one place to another place. And so we're treating urban designs and architecture as products. Do you want this? You can buy this. Here you are, here you are. Do you want this one? We want that one. And it's like going into a department store, or even to a supermarket. I have one of those and one of those. It's a brand image. And so architects develop brand images and they sell them. You immediately recognize the work of Frank Gehry as Zaha, and you recognize the work of Norman Foster, and then you recognize the work of individual architectural firms from particular societies. So this is the transference of a model from Shanghai to Ahmedabad. And these are two very, very different worlds. The question that I put to you, what is the individual building that is in the water? What's its use? Because this design I've seen 20 times. Guess what's the building? We had one in Sydney. It got rejected.
Temple.
No, not a temple. Temple of modern life. No, it's a hotel, a 5-star hotel. Okay, why architects want to stick 5-star hotels in the water? I'm not, or maybe it's the property developers who want their buildings to be really seen, and so on. So this is somewhat amusing, but the serious point is, we've got to be very careful of carrying ideas from one place to another without really analyzing what the issues are of concern in the new case. So, end up with a couple of observations which you can quite clearly read there. So, thank you very much.
Don't go away. I have to field the questions here and feed them to John. Does anybody got anything specific they want to ask? I think that John's opened up a sort of Pandora's box, because I think most people here looking at vernacular is, you can have a New York vernacular, you can have a Los Angeles vernacular, you can have a Florida vernacular. And so I think that what John's done really is just point to this really important idea that we have to dissolve, I think, the preconceptions that we have about what vernacular is in order to develop it. If we keep thinking about vernacular as a Tarajan Tonkanen, and that's the model for everything else, we're not going to get very far. And I think it applies very much to Balinese architecture too. If we keep thinking about Balinese vernacular as the traditional Balinese house and the temples and things like that, there will be no modern vernacular in Bali. We have to transform these ideas and make something new that's as good. You got it?
More functional aspects of vernacular. I was wondering if you would like to sort of comment on the fact that vernacular buildings often come out of really complex sociocultural and religious sort of relationships, and what that sort of impact means in terms of the production of space. Like Marcus Vellinger talks about this idea of cultural embodiment of vernacular and its lessons, and understanding about how those social relations actually impact the design of space. You talked about the vernacular being self-conscious, but potentially those social relations are quite self-conscious. So I was just wondering what that means in terms of the design of urban space and what we could learn from that sort of insight, which is possibly less tangible than the construction, climatic considerations. Rather than learning from just the tangible pragmatics of built construction and materials and sustainability through those ideas, but actually through understanding social relationships that have created the building that then might offer insight into the future design of urban space.
Okay. I'll probably talk around your question rather than address it head on. I found the concept of affordance very useful, and that different patterns of the environment afford different things for different people, based on their competencies, depending on their resources, and so on. Now, we may look at the traditional city, okay, whether it's the vernacular or a much more what I call self-conscious or design city, and we can look at those patterns and what they afford. Okay. That if you look at the work of Patrick Geddes in India, okay, where what he did was what we call selective surgery of constructive surgery. I don't know what the correct term is now, on traditional low-income areas of the city. Okay. And so we can work that way, but in terms of designing something completely new, all one can do is create the affordances for the type of social relationships which might develop. Whether they develop or not will depend on the predispositions of the people involved and their competencies. Now, the danger that I was trying to point out is that we fall in love with certain images, and the image becomes more important. In fact, for me, the symbolic function of architecture really needs to be understood much more coherently, and it competes time and time again with designing for any other purpose. That's the best I can do.
Okay.
It may not be very good.
Gentleman over there.
My question is regarding how would we deal with this problem? Because the lifestyle is modernizing, but the villages, you have cars in villages also now. So concrete is coming in, replacing the traditional material and influencing the architecture of that place. I would like to have your comment on this.
World and people who call the shots do a lot in the way of property development. And you can set up conservation zones like Little India, and you can design, you create the principles for retaining that area, but you really need a very, very strong administration like Singapore has to actually keep a place the way it is. And you can see in that slide, that's also India is surrounded by a large-scale development. So it has again to be a self-conscious decision. Yes, we want to do this. Why do you want to do it? Well, if I'm cynical, then it's, well, it helps the tourist trade and so on. Whether it supports ways of life of people there, I don't know. I don't know Little India very well. I've had a haircut there and had a meal there, but I've been a tourist, which is why it's been kept that way, bringing people like me in. So I have no real answer to your question. Those are it's your job to deal with questions like that.
Appreciation of genuine communities and authentic architecture, whatever form it may take. Like you said, New York is also vernacular, and so whatever form it may take, arising from old-fashioned concept of spirit of the place.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we also use the same kind of marketing tools to reach out to and also manipulate taste?
Grow up, really trap you. And if you take Frank Lloyd Wright, he never got out of Spring Valley, Wisconsin. Le Corbusier never gave up on his Calvinistic education until very late in his career. Ebenezer Howard grew up in suburbs of London, and so on. And so I'm drifting from the point, but the point is that you're all marketers. And the question is, I think many of us feel much more comfortable in studying our area and becoming expert in it, but not in terms of being a strong advocate for it in the public arena. I don't know, there are one or two architects who become politicians, but very few. And so we're all politicians, we need to act that way. Don't ask me to, I'm too old, I'm retired.
Final question, just one last one, okay?
I think
This lady here, I think.
I already have the mic here.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm self-conscious.
Subconscious, yes.
Unself-conscious.
Okay, to make it short, can you please expand this topic again, for me at least? Thank you very much.
No, I've just found it useful to talk about self-conscious decisions and unself-conscious decisions. But if you take the city as a whole, there are very few cities, well, actually there's more cities than I care to admit who've been totally designed. But by and large, cities grow by self-conscious decision after self-conscious decision of building by building, sometimes a larger scale project, urban design project, but usually component by component. Now each component may be very self-conscious, but when you look at the whole complex, it has not come from a very clear self-conscious decision. Now it's true that legal mechanisms, zoning, building bylaws, which shape the decisions that people can make. Okay? And they can be quite powerful, and so on. But by and large, the city that emerges from these smaller self-conscious decisions is largely unself-conscious. And we look at it, and some of us will admire the results, and some people will want to change the results. And architects, in general, want to have a different city.
Okay, I think we have to move on. Is that right? Are you? Okay. John, again, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation.
Well, your questions are wonderful. They're very important. They're not ones easy to address in a short statement. So my objective was to get you to challenge what I was saying. So thank you very much for that.